Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this first Wednesday meeting at the Frontline Club. Normally, as some of you may know, it's Paddy O'Connell here in the chair, but I've taken over tonight. My name is Nick Fielding. I think we've got a great panel here this evening, and I think we'll have a very, very interesting discussion. On the left here, Sami Zubaida is Emeritus Professor of Politics and Sociology at Birkbeck College, author of Law and Power in the Islamic World, very well-known figure. To my immediate left here is Humphrey Hawksley, BBC World Affairs correspondent, author and commentator. To my immediate right, Najibullah Razaq, a journalist and expert on Afghanistan, who's produced numerous programs on Afghanistan and Pakistan, primarily for the BBC. Is that correct? Yeah. Yes. And on my right here, Reid, Afghanistan researcher at Human Rights Watch. So we've got a fantastic panel. The format for this evening is fairly straightforward. Each of the people on the panel here will speak fairly briefly before we move on to an almost open discussion, a pretty open discussion from the floor. I hope you'll have plenty of questions. There's lots of expertise here to test. And I look forward to your contribution as much as anything else. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Humphrey to talk about his new book, which I hope some of you had a chance to see. And if you haven't yet, maybe afterwards you would like to buy a copy there down here at the front. Can I remind you all, just before we start off, please check your mobiles that they are switched to silent or switched off, so that we don't have any unwanted intrusions in the middle of this discussion. Humphrey's book, Democracy Kills, What's So Good About Having the Vote? Fantastic title and a fantastic subject. I think one which has made us all think, particularly over recent weeks. There has been resignation after resignation, particularly in relation to Afghanistan. We are really seeing that there are substantial problems with the democratic project, if we can call it that, in Afghanistan. So, Humphrey, please tell us about your book.
Thank you, Nick. I'm not quite sure how to pitch it to the frontline audience, because most of you are my peers and know a lot more about the subject than I do. I was at a talk on Saturday on the same topic, but a sort of lay talk, and somebody from the end there said, "You fascist bastard," as I was talking about Democracy Kills. Then I got an email in from somebody, from another one, calling me an unconstructed Western idealist, and when I Googled that, it didn't quite come up. So I emailed her back, and it turns out that this is, and there's a lot of us around, apparently, if I am one, people that still worship Mao and Pol Pot, and Fidel Castro also goes into that sort of basket of stuff of 30 or 40 years ago. She turned out to be a rather pleasant Bulgarian poet. So you can see where she was coming from, actually, because she had lived under a dictatorship. And then I was at a talk in Edinburgh, and it was a fairly sort of peaceful and tranquil audience that I hope you guys aren't going to be. And we got some questions that didn't amount to much. But at the end, this wonderful person came up to me, about 85 years old, dame on a walking stick, and tugged me like this and said, "You wouldn't talk like that if you had lived in Spain under Franco." And you could see that all these contradictions and things that are going through. So I thought I'd begin my pitch by having two quotations, one from 1947, which is Churchill. "No one pretends that democracy is all perfect or all wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time." In other words, we know that it's bad, but so what? We're going to go with it. Let's wind on to 2008, Barack Obama. "In our ability to shape a better world, we've got to be honest and mindful of the fact that different countries are at different phases, have different cultural histories. And if we think that we can just plunge in and say, create a democracy from scratch in 5 years, then we're badly mistaken. What we haven't got yet, that I've identified, I hope somebody has, is what you do whilst you're creating that democracy. Because at the moment, what we tend to do is hold an election. And as we've seen in Afghanistan in recent weeks, it doesn't always work that well. The problem that we've got sitting here in the sort of liberal, chattering democratic classes is that there is this other encroaching system that seems to be pushing up against the West, saying that we're doing things better, which is coming from China or the statistics from Cuba and that sort of thing. And I don't think that's being addressed by anybody. In fact, I have a sort of party trick, which I won't use here, where I ask people if they would prefer in an apocalypse to, and the whole world's been destroyed, and they've got two choices of a place to live. One is Cuba, and one is Haiti. That's had every democratic opportunity going, including a UN peacekeeping operation that's called, without any irony at all, Operation Uphold Democracy. Now, Cubans live for 20 years longer, their health service is better, you guys probably know all this, but they are under an authoritarian regime. And you ask the question, all the hands go up for Cuba. And then you say, why did you choose Cuba? And they giggle and say, well, I like the music there. And they're not engaging the argument any more than our political leaders are engaging the argument, because why is somebody from the sort of liberal cultural classes want to go and live under a dictatorial regime when they could go and live in Haiti under a democratic regime? And it's not actually being properly engaged. How long do I have, Nick?
About another 5 minutes.
5 minutes, that's fine, yeah. So I just wanted to go through then where I think we are at the moment. It's 20 years since the end of the Cold War, more or less, come Monday. Communism and fascism defeated. Western democracy has had a pretty uncompetitive canvas on which to prove itself. Europe's expanded and become richer, but it was rich anyway. And the poorer countries there have got the beacons of the richer countries to go towards, as we've seen in the European Union. Russia tried it, didn't like it, and it's gone back to authoritarianism. China, after Tiananmen, decided to go for it and has forged ahead. Africa, whose countries held election after election after election, has slid backwards. So we've got a situation now where, when Churchill made his proclamation, the Chinese were poorer than the Africans. Now the young Chinese are taking out mortgages on their first homes, while the Africans are fighting disease, hunger, and tribal conflict. Chinese traders are all over Africa, buying roads, building roads and buying up materials, and a lot of people have predicted that would have been the other way around, and that didn't actually work out like that. So what a lot of people in the developing world see our system as being, when I say our, it's this, is that the post-Cold War era has created a prescription of the free market democracies. And what do you have? You have a lot of double standards there. You've got the free market doctrine that's barred many farmers from getting subsidies in the developing world, yet in Europe and America it is agreed that agricultural subsidies are a foundation for political stability there. So how come it's for Europe and not for Africa? You've got the same thing with import tariffs. If you manufacture something in Africa, it's very prohibitively expensive to export it to Europe. So you can't create a manufacturing base there, so that's the economy dealt with. And then you have the elections, which are routinely used by Western governments, as they are being in Afghanistan now, as a benchmark of acceptability. Yet very often they end up protecting the political elite and doing little to improve the lives of the poor. So what you actually have happening there is that you have asking a population to choose between competing groups of vested interests, and time and again we see them relying on force and patronage, parliaments not really representing the people, and tribalism, ethnic cleansing, and all those sort of things being accentuated. The reason for this is because the institutions aren't strong enough to deal with it, including an election commission that again we saw in Afghanistan, but a neutral police force, banking laws, and all those sort of things. And when you have that democracy in place, as again we saw in Afghanistan, you get, in order to win the votes, for example, Hamid Karzai put in a law where you can starve your wife if she refuses to have sex with you. So in order to get his votes and be a good Democrat, he has to do this. Now, in Europe, again, we have double standards here. Because in our fragile states in Europe, in Bosnia, for example, they do not have sovereign democracy. They have on top of them a high representative, an appointed technocrat or diplomat that holds things in check. And if, for example, Britain hypothetically elected the BNP in, and all sorts of dreadful laws started being passed, the European Union would move in to stop those laws being passed. Yet somehow in Afghanistan, this happens, and it's legitimate because it's a democracy, and it's what the Afghan people want. So so what we have is, in my views, we have a situation where, since the Cold War, we've been putting down prescriptive measures that we do not use for ourselves, but we are somehow wanting them to be installed into these societies when our societies have taken 2 world wars and American civil wars, various bills of rights, and hundreds of years to get to where we are now. We are asking the developing world to do it immediately without any conflict. And that's a huge challenge at all. And what I think the way forward would be is to take the arguments from Taiwan and Korea, which are democracies that have succeeded, what is happening in Bosnia, what is happening in, in India, for example. Look at all those, and then look at what is happening in China and what is happening in Cuba. Instead of polarizing them into ideological arguments, put them together and get a system that works. Because when Churchill made that quote in 1947, and the Cold War was coming up, the West was devising the policy that would stop the Soviet Union. The policy of containment was a policy, sophisticated policy. Like it or not, there was a policy on the table. Since 9/11, no policy has been drawn up of how to fix a fragile state, bring people out of poverty, and stop the threat of terrorism that's happening. But one thing that's clear is that elections are not doing the business. And I'll stop there.
Humphrey, thank you very much for that very stimulating and very challenging introduction. Rachel, you've lived in Afghanistan for the last 2 and a bit years. A very astute observer of human rights issues there. Could you talk to some of those issues, please?
Sure. I mean, I'll focus on Afghanistan, of course. That's the only bit of this I know about. I'm sympathetic to a lot of what Humphrey's saying. I mean, Afghanistan is being criticised now for the evidence of failed democracy. But Afghanistan doesn't have a democracy yet. It was just given Potemkin elections, that's all. And to have expected some kind of free and fair election in a country where you've got such insecurity and such impunity was fanciful. It was never going to happen. So for various members of the international community, NATO, the UK government, the US governments in particular, and the UN, to have suggested that 2009 was the year of the election, the big operation in Helmand that we saw was about helping people to deliver their votes, we're setting expectations up far too high. None of my Afghan friends expressed any of the hysteria that we saw in the international community about how bad these elections are. They know that they don't have rule of law, they don't have security, they don't even have political parties, they don't quite have a free press. So in those circumstances, you were never going to get a clear, free and fair election. So what's alarming to see now is that you get this, you get the signs that the international community might suddenly unravel everything that it's doing there. Rather than to be a bit more honest about what they have managed to achieve there and what Afghans are seeking to achieve there, which is going to take a hell of a long time. And whether there's the appetite for that kind of long-term strategy in Afghanistan is a very different question. I mean, Afghans were, they didn't have a great choice in these elections, partly because of the things I was outlining before, but because of a structure that actually the international community is very complicit in. We have a political class in Afghanistan that's dominated by former warlords, current criminals, people who run illegal armed groups, militias, and the international community does business with all of these people. They hire their militias to guard their bases. They have ambassadorial meetings with them. The first guy that President Obama invited to the White House to see him after he was elected is a man who's notorious for having drug interests in Afghanistan. So to then turn around to Karzai and say, OK, now you've been given another chance, but this time you clean up and you stop corruption, is, is not admitting that they themselves are actually part of that corruption. And they've sat by whilst this system, this very corrupt system, has evolved. So, I mean, I think there's much more need for a lot more honesty about what the reality is on the ground, because anyone who understood what was really happening in Afghanistan was not really surprised by what we've just seen over the last few weeks and months. Now, does that mean that Afghans don't want democracy? Does that mean that we should all, give up hope and that, these people want another system? Because there's often a bit of kind of, underlying racism, I find sometimes in some of those who want to pull back from Afghanistan now, who are calling for, withdrawal and a removal of troops and resources and political ambition. The suggestion that Afghans don't actually want democracy. Afghanistan is an incredibly young country. Something like 70% of the population is 25 or under. And they themselves, a lot of them don't feel that they're necessarily represented by this class of old warlords. Do they want democracy? A lot of them, yes. I mean, one of the things I did before joining Human Rights Watch was I was involved with a documentary called Afghanistan, which is about the Afghan equivalent of Pop Idol. Afghans embraced that vote with open arms, and frankly, had they been given a phone vote for their president, we might have seen a lot less corruption than we saw in the last few weeks. So I think there is an appetite for democracy, and to sound some positive notes amid the gloom, which is not something I do very often, to be honest. What we did see in this election, despite all the hideous fraud and despite the huge number of attacks by the Taliban, we saw 2 female presidential candidates contesting for the presidency, and not one of the main religious groups criticised this. That, to me, is huge progress, that level of acceptance that women are part of the political spectrum. Although they face attacks and they've been assassinated, still they run and they are increasingly accepted. We saw an ethnic Hazara candidate running and coming in 3rd place and even scoring quite a lot of votes from other ethnicities, including Pashtuns, which I think surprised many. So that's suggesting that some of the ethnic divisions that a lot of the patronage networks in Afghanistan run along are not insurmountable. We saw 6,000 Afghans volunteer to be part of the Election Monitoring Commission, FIFA it's called. I mean, we saw lots of signs of real engagement with the political process. And lots of signs that there is a real appetite for change, for modernisation, but the thought that it can be done in 8 years, that you can go from Taliban to democracy in 8 years, is clearly nonsense, particularly when you've got, an insurgency that is now raging in, 1/3 to a half of the country, that's, increased hugely in the last few years. It was never going to be an easy election, but I say don't give up on it yet.
Thank you, Rachel. Najibullah, perhaps you can address those 2 issues that came out there as well. The question of about whether people in Afghanistan genuinely want democracy. Is that a phenomenon which is confined to young people, or is it much wider than that? And secondly, the question about whether the project of democracy is actually feasible in Afghanistan. Those 2 issues.
It's a... First of all, we have to give a definition to democracy. What kind of democracy do you want for Afghanistan? Because the perception of Afghans of democracy is drinking, nightclubs and corruption, that kind of. That's how it's been.
They must be enthusiastic about
it. We're living in a realities and the model of democracy that the West is, or the vision of democracy that West is trying to impose in Afghanistan. I think it's not possible. It's not going to work. We have to draw a line, and we have to be realistic. The West cannot afford to impose democracy in Afghanistan because the West has become bankrupt. And the war in Afghanistan, by the estimates of economists, it cost nearly $3 trillion. And in pumping money to an endless war is going to create problems back in the West. And also the approach of West to democracy in Afghanistan, it's actually causing causing lots of chaos, which is benefiting, radical Islam is benefiting from it. And their line is that, look, the West is trying to, is actually telling you that your women folks should not wear burqas, you should be allowed to listen to music. I mean, this is, radical Islam is using this line to try to recruit people. And this vision of democracy in Afghanistan is not going to work. It's not, because it's been perceived with a wrong definition. Afghanistan was a democratic society before the invasion of, in its own version of democracy, before the invasion of Soviet Union. Now we had Jirga system, we had, which is not much different with the election, apart from women folks don't take part.
Peter.
Instead of imposing democracy, if democracy was promoted within the societies, I think it would have worked much better and would have cost less than imposing with condition. Because at the end of the day, this is backfiring. This is making people more radical. And Afghanistan is not a European country. Afghanistan was involved in 3 decades of bloody war, beginning with Soviet Union and then civil war, which made people more religious. Before 3 decades, people were kind of semi-religious, but because of this invasion, West and neighboring countries needed a recruitment tool to get Afghans to fight. So they promoted jihad. They promoted very extremist vision of Islam, so to get people to fight against the Russian. And now it's backfiring, and they want to just undo that, by pumping money, sending more troops, and imposing their kind of democratic version. First, I think there should be a line. They should draw a line and say, look, this is what we mean. We do not want to be democratic as we have Germany, or France, or United States. And then after that, instead of imposing and putting condition, it has to be promoted. Afghans should kind of embarrass democracy themselves. They shouldn't be like exported like a box of candy, so they can take it with tea, and the next day when they wake up, they a father who will never allow to give the name of his daughter to someone. He will tell his daughter, you can actually go to school and you can marry whoever you want. This is not going to happen. It's going to take time, but the democracy should be the West should not impose the vision of democracy that it has for for the West.
Thank you. Sami, you are a political scientist. Humphrey has put forward a very coherent description of maybe the last 40, 50 years of history, not necessarily prescriptive, but there's certainly a description. Would you like to comment on that and what it may mean?
Sure. No, I agree wholeheartedly with most of what. Do I need? I agree wholeheartedly with what Humphrey had argued, and I would like to expand a bit with a bit of historical depth and say that this identification of democracy with voting and elections is absurd. That in actual fact, if we look historically, how did what we call now democracy develop, first of all, in Western Europe, well, primarily England, and then France and so on. It did not develop because somebody decided we're going to have democracy. It developed in the process of fierce struggles and wars and civil wars and revolutions. And it had many setbacks and then progresses. And the question, and this of course was also accompanied by enormous socio-economic change, the development of capitalism in these countries and of industrial capitalism, which of course itself also generated class struggles and disputes of various kinds and civil wars and what have you. So in fact, what you have in the 20th century, at least in Britain and France and maybe Holland, is something that is produced over centuries, not peacefully, but through struggles. And in all this, and don't let anyone tell you that this is to do with culture or religion. Religion was always against democracy. And part of these struggles that happened in Europe were against the church as much as against the state. So in this respect, Islam and Christianity and Buddhism, Judaism are not very different at all. In fact, the way in which then Christianity came, or at least the mainstream Christian churches in the West came to accept democracy and indeed promote it, is precisely because they had to give up their authoritarian authority as part of the old regime. And this, of course, also happened in part of the so-called Muslim world. There's no more Muslim world than there is a Christian world. You know, there are lots of different countries and situations, and you can see in the kind of Ottoman lands, in Turkey and Egypt and many other countries, that in fact, from the 19th century on, you had similar kind of developments in these countries with regard to Islam, but that in fact this was reversed in many places in the later parts of the 20th century for a diversity of reasons. So in fact, this idea, this explanation in terms of culture doesn't really hold. What really holds is that countries and regions have different histories, and these histories are not just culture and religion. They are to do with an economic history, with the development of institutions, classes, and what have you. And what you see then in Europe is that until quite recently, many parts of Europe were not at all democratic. I mean, the man who told you about Franco and living under Franco, you know, Franco was not peculiar. You know, the whole of Southern Europe, Germany, Italy, were all, you know, had a brief experiments with democracy, but then went back to terrible authoritarian regimes. And in fact, it was really only in the second half of the 20th century that you had the development of democracy, democratic institutions. But I want to say is that obviously one of the essential elements of democracy is representation, is voting, but that comes much later. In actual fact, what you have first of all is the development of institutions and the transformation of the state from being a power state into being an infrastructural power, one which dominates society not through sheer force or warlords or what have you, but through the interconnection of institutions. And this, of course, is far from being the case in Afghanistan. It has happened in somewhere like Turkey to some extent, but hesitatingly. And important elements of these institutions is the development of legal institutions and the rule of law, which guarantee security, basic human rights, and what have you. And there's no use having elections, as we see in Afghanistan and Iraq and many other, and Africa, as you were just saying. There's no point in holding elections when you don't have these basic conditions. And now, what conclusions do we draw from this? You obviously can't impose democracy, but you can't impose democracy not because their culture is different or their religion is different, but because their societies are different, their histories are different. How do you proceed? I'm glad I don't have to answer that question.
And on that note, we're all leaving now very quick. Right, a fascinating introduction to this whole area. I'm sure that you must all have questions, and maybe you want to say a little bit yourself. So please feel free now to, if you want to ask specific questions to specific speakers, feel free to do that. If you want to make a more general comment, do that. I may group bits and pieces, whatever you say, and I will shut you up if you go on too long. Who would like to speak? Gentleman here.
So a couple of very quick observations and then a big question. So first observation is it sounds like it's taken us a long time to get where we've got to, and therefore there's some kind of stability in where we are. But my impression is that if next year, as some of the more extreme pundits are suggesting, our economy does go to an Armageddon, and we lose all our money and all our banking system, and therefore the ability to pay our police and our hospitals, etc., we might actually very quickly go a long way back in history, and the democracy might be a question for ourselves. Second observation is, if in Afghanistan everybody had got the right to vote, I'm not convinced we would have liked the outcome and been convinced.
Same outcome.
Being convinced that democracy was such a good thing. So, and then now the question, it seems to me that people start being more like us when they have more money and they have the ability to be free in their own lives, and therefore they stop worrying about what their neighbor's doing. Why are we not focusing on making Afghanistanis a little bit wealthier, having more money to do what they want, and then democracy might have a chance? Shouldn't that be more the focus than giving them an electoral system?
Thank you. Humphrey, would you like to come back on that point? Is it a question of money? Is that the connection?
It's more complicated. I think it's what we heard here. It's this very complex texture of building things up. And I've been to one place that did it, which was Taiwan. And Taiwan in the 1960s was poorer than Africa. It was war-torn. It had China at its heels. And it could have done a number of things. It could have kept everybody in refugee camps. It could have sent bombers over to the mainland to keep all that going up. But it didn't. The dictatorship was there, and gradually it built up its economy. And I talked to an economist there, and I said, when did you decide to loosen up? And he said, we loosened up in 1985 when the per capita income was $5,000 per head in 1985. And we felt that that meant that everybody had enough stake in the society to want it to keep going and not to go and do something else. And he said, and once you loosened up the economy this was at this time, and you stopped the state-run thing, and then we were managing to build the health service up and the roads and the law courts and the civil society, and people were getting money in, and then money felt safe to go in there and invest because the rule of law began and the judiciary opened and closed cases. And then he said in 1996, we were able to hold a presidential election. China didn't like it, but we voted in a president, and everybody got up in the next morning and went to work, and nothing had actually changed. And he gave it to me in a much longer detail than that, which was quite interesting. And I said to him at the end of it, I said, has anybody in Iraq or Afghanistan flown you over to Washington to ask you about that? He said, no. Nobody's been to us at all on how this is done. He's now the national security advisor in Taiwan. He was then running an opposition election when I talked to him. But it can be done, and they did it. Korea did it. Bosnia's doing it under this umbrella. But it's not overnight.
Gentleman here.
There's this arrogance of cultural imperialism whereby Western states assume that they have the authority or the right to nation build, and that almost extends by proxy to the citizens. And so therefore we have these debates about how to rebuild Afghanistan, how to rebuild Africa, and this is something which I find very, very arrogant. I mean, that we don't listen to the nations. I mean, Western nations came to Africa, said in Africa we were naked and away from godliness, and therefore we should put on clothes. Then you go to the Middle East and you say you're wearing too much, takes them off. But that's you set the paradigm and you expect, without respecting the cultural values of the nations you go to or visit. There's this arrogance that you have the right. And I find even these discussions, I can't imagine being in Africa somewhere whereby we have a meeting in a centre whereby we're discussing how we can do this for England or this for Europe. But we here seem to think we have the right to, and the responsibility, not just the governments, but as citizens, the liberals within the societies, to rebuild the world. And I just think that there needs to be much more dialogue, much more respect of the cultural values and societies that you wish to engage with.
Anybody like to come back on those points? Or shall I take another question? Gentleman here.
Maybe building directly on this point, the interesting thing about Afghanistan is that the original rationale wasn't so much a war of choice or a nation-building project, but as Barack Obama is fond of repeating, a war of necessity. So assuming you're in Afghanistan, having overthrown the Taliban government, what are you supposed to do? Pack up and leave? But if you are going to go forwards and decide to stay there, how can you build up a system? Everyone seems to agree it takes a lot of time. Well, there might be a limited time commitment, and further, what are your minimum values, saying, right, this we will insist on. And I think one of the panelists spoke about issues with women. I think these are questions that need to be addressed.
Can I come back a little bit? Sort of in relation to your point as well. I mean, Nico has lived in Afghanistan as well for a couple of years. Is right to say that you know, whatever you thought of the reasons for going into Afghanistan in 2001, there was a genuine demand, and there still is quite a genuine demand among many Afghans for there to be an international presence and international assistance there. There's even still a majority who want the international military there, despite years now of civilian casualties. And a lot of people clearly want a lot of help in development and reconstruction. And there's an extent to which many of the countries who are there now as donors and as armies were, you know, very much responsible for many of the mistakes that happened in the decades preceding. You know, they built up a lot of the current warlords who dominate the country now in the war against the Soviets. And when they pulled out after the Soviets left, there was civil war. And there is fear again in Afghanistan, among some Afghans at least, that if they pull out again now, there will again be civil war. So I think it's slightly different, but there is certainly a lot of, and a lot of Afghans resent this hugely. There's a lot of attempts to impose Western ideas there. There's a lot of people who come with their own predetermined ideas about how you do development, how you build, you know, this sort of shambolic Potemkin democracy. And they don't. It's not grassroots. It's not based on, you know, things like the Jirga system that Najib mentions. It's not based on enough of the kind of Afghan traditions. So there is a lot of Western imperialism, call it what you will, in terms of the way in which people respond to Afghanistan. But I don't think the very presence there is in itself not welcomed by the majority of Afghans of the international community. I think still they would like them to be there. They'd like them to stop killing civilians, which, I mean, that's happening to an extent. We've seen a drop by half of civilian casualties, but there's still hundreds being killed. And they'd like to see much more trust in Afghans to make their own decisions about how things should be done. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot that's being done wrong and continues to be done wrong.
I'd just like to, this point here is...
The mic is on the floor.
Is it really? Yes. I was in Liberia not too long ago, where they're trying to rebuild. Liberia and Sierra Leone have got these sort of parallel stories. And and it's very different the way they're doing it. In Liberia, we were in the middle of God knows where, a village called Zagorwe, and we bumped into a parish council meeting, basically. And the guy, I said, how are you doing it? And he said, what we're doing is we're going into the villages, and then we're going into the clans in the village, and we ask them what they want. And they will decide the priorities between the road or the electricity or the whatever it is, and they know the budgets, and they will decide, and then the democracy there becomes accountable. In Sierra Leone, it was totally different, because they were building there. I said to one of the aid people, I said, what's the big thing that's going to show that this? Well, we're building a power station that's going to light up Freetown. And everybody outside of Freetown thought, one, it was being preferential to the elite, and secondly, in their villages, they didn't want electricity. I mean, they had torches and flashlights. They wanted a road that could go from A to B. And I had a Sierra Leonean interpreter in Liberia with me, and he said, why don't we do it like this? Why don't we actually go down before being prescriptive about it? And I think that's what you were talking about a bit, wasn't it?
Yes, I mean, I've worked in Sierra Leone extensively and travelled with the rebels at RUF. We were one of the first to travel with them, I think. But the dialogue that I have with people out there, it's different to what we hear on the mainstream. It's different to what we hear in the mainstream in terms of, you know, the demands. You know, the demands I think that many people want in terms of the electricity, the roads, and everything else. They want the governments to deliver this, not necessarily the aid agencies. I don't think it's sustainable if aid agencies come in all the time, and you know the corruption that then is associated with that. But you know, there's a great respect for the local tribal systems that they have, whether it be in Sierra Leone and Liberia, and they want this to be enforced and not sort of destroyed and replaced with Western.
Yeah. Jump on the back there.
Thank you. I'm a British Iraqi. I've spent the past year living in Iraq. Just got back. Sorry. I've just spent the past year living in Iraq, in Baghdad. And whilst I would agree that elections are only a part of democracy, I would argue that actually in Iraq, specifically, they're a very critical part. And we inherited a top-down democratic approach in Iraq. And we didn't have the luxury of sort of building our democratic culture and our democratic institutions before going into elections. But I think actually if you look at it, and I was there during the provincial elections in January, and I saw the enthusiasm with which people were engaging in the elections. I think it's actually a critical part of developing this democratic culture, engaging Iraqis in the democratic process and giving it legitimacy. So I just thought I'd give that comment and wondering what the panel think about that.
Yes, I mean, just on that point, I mean, I was beginning to wonder, are we in danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater here? I mean, I think everybody faced with the Taliban regime in power in Kabul would have said we should get rid of them and replace them with democracy. We all said it, didn't we? And now we seem to be saying that actually that's not the right answer either. So how far back do we bend the stick? Humphrey, sorry.
I just wondered, because at this point, you're absolutely right, and I found it too, particularly when they were negotiating the American troop withdrawal, real horse trading going on in the Parliament, and you report that democracy is taking root. But is it worth 1 million lives to get that far? Wouldn't it have been better to wait 10 or 15 years and not have the Sunni and the Shia pitted against each other for generation after generation? Sure, it might work in the end in some form, but the challenge that we're throwing out to the developing world, whether it's Liberia and Sierra Leone or Iraq or Afghanistan, is to get to a place where those basic rights are being upheld, but without the slaughter that we produced when we were doing it. And if is it worth the cost to see that engagement that reality threw up?
I think a lot more lives were lost under Saddam, the past 35 years of Ba'athist rule, and I would say, as I said, we inherited the war and the aftermath of it. I'm not trying to defend the planning that came after the war and the sectarian violence that came after that. But what I'm saying is that we're at a situation now where we have elections coming up in January, and they're a critical part of instilling the democracy in Iraq.
Sami, yes.
Yes, I think that, first of all, I don't think anybody is, or most people are not arguing against democracy. It's just saying that it's, the way in which democracy is identified with the ballot box and voting and hardly anything else is wrong. And what is more, that in fact the way to actually achieve democracy is really very difficult. It's not that it's not desirable. And I think in the case of Iraq, I mean, I don't know much about Afghanistan. It's quite different. And I think our friend is quite right in saying that, well, under Saddam, the ethnic violence was monopolized by the regime. They were doing a lot of sectarian violence over successive periods. The rights and wrongs of the invasion of Iraq is a different matter, and obviously people should hesitate before endorsing invasions of that kind. But I think to come back to what I was saying earlier, the question of changing the structure of the country, is that in fact I get the impression that in Afghanistan, localism, people being centered within a locality, with a local power structure, with local warlords, their whole life chances being dependent on the networks of the tribe and the warlords and so on. That is really entrenched in Afghanistan. And that is one of the greatest hindrances to the development of institutions at the societal level. And Iraq is not that. Iraq in fact, has much more of a history of the development of classes and institutions and the social division of labor. And in fact, you can see the Ba'ath regime in Iraq was a reversal of the progress that had been made in the first half of the 20th century until the 1970s. But even then, even 1970s under the Ba'ath, continued these kinds of developments, and certainly the development of a secular society. Iraqi society was highly secularized. And even now, the sectarian violence is not very much to do with religion, not any more than in Northern Ireland it was to do with Catholicism or Protestantism as religion. It's to do with communities. So, I mean, in this respect, I think there is more, I mean, don't get me wrong, I think the situation in Iraq is grim. But there is somehow more of a basis there for developments of institutions and for the basis of democracy than there is in Afghanistan.
Gentleman there. Oh, sorry. If you bear with us.
Hi. First of all, can I congratulate Humphrey for writing a book with such a provocative title. I'm sure the contents are probably more sumptuous than the cover. I'll put this question to any member of the panel. A few months ago, I asked a UK Secretary for International Development why the UK was condoning despots in the Great Lakes region of Africa. And his answer was poetic, to put it mildly. He said to me, British foreign policy does not turn like a London taxi. It turns like a ship. So the question I put to the panel is the Western notion of strategic national interest guilty for the failure of the democratic project outside the West? Thank you.
Is there anybody who would like to answer that particular point? It's a tough question.
Don't know about taxis and ships.
Well, I mean, could I just say that sorry, before you, Humphrey, I'm sure you say a lot on this, and I enjoyed your book very much, by the way. But I mean, isn't it true, certainly, that in most Muslim lands, certainly throughout the Middle East, the West has prevented any democracy emerging? So following on what you're talking there about the, Africa, and if there were democratic regimes, truly democratic regimes in, say, Egypt, Algeria, probably the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, would come to power. Policies to Israel would be toppled immediately. And ever since, I think, Standard Oil discovered oil in Saudi Arabia in about 1930s, the United States has seen its policy as manipulating and corrupting these governments. That, to me, is a very salient truth. And therefore, how can they pretend to be wanting democracy in certain countries when they quite clearly, a whole region has been denied the ability to choose their own destiny?
I mean, I think I thought about it. I had to, because it's a very good question. I won't answer it, but this problem that this is falling off, that Phil raises and also you raises, it's completely double standards. So what I think has got to happen is got to change from strategic and national interest to a global interest. Because back in the 50s, the elections in Vietnam were cancelled because they thought Ho Chi Minh was going to win. Then you had the coup in Chile with Allende, and this goes right up to the Hamas victory in the Palestinian territories and in Gaza.
Not to mention Iran.
Not to mention Iran. Algeria as well. So this whole double standard of democracy. What worries me is that we are where we are with Iraq and Afghanistan because this is a legacy of the Bush era. But there's now a time to try to turn things perhaps as fast as a London taxi, because I'm concerned about the other ones that will crop up. Do we all want to be sitting here discussing Burma in 5 years from now? Because we've had an instant election in Burma, and we have Karen terrorists all over the place doing things. What is going to happen to Cuba? North Korea will probably be all right because it's got South Korea and China sort of mentoring it through. But I don't see from our political... I mean, I think there's a broad agreement in this room about the premise of it. But the only sort of questioning review I've had on the book was with Dennis McShane in the Financial Times, who's a New Labour guy. And he can't, of course, say that democracy kills. So I haven't seen what we do here and we've seen percolate up to our political leadership. So I think to answer your question, the answer's no. They haven't even thought yet of how to deal with the generals in Burma. If they suddenly say, okay, fine, Aung San Suu Kyi can come in tomorrow, nobody's got a plan in the back pocket, apart from, oh, well, let's have an election. and then what happens?
Gentleman here.
Yes, surely the failure of the policy in Afghanistan stems back to the original objectives, which were really to subdue the country, remove the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, which 8 years after has fundamentally failed. And now we're being, led astray by this notion of imposing democracy or trying to nation build in some way, which also is failing. I mean, the fundamental problem here is that in the Muslim world, there's not a problem with democracy in the sense of voting and representative governance. The issue is that the Muslim world, the Islamic world, believes in Sharia law, whereas the Western world believes in secular liberal democracy. So that is where the divide is. Surely it is now time to accept that there is a failure, fundamental failure, to impose these standards and ideas in Afghanistan and elsewhere, and it's time to withdraw, as indeed Kim Howells said. And my last point is I'm really worried that we're now being led into a similar conflict in Pakistan on the basis of American ambitions in that country.
Can I come back to that?
Yes.
I just want to, I've sort of made this point to an extent. I mean, Afghanistan hasn't been given democracy, and when Bush talked about nation building, it was nonsense. He wasn't nation building. He was giving them a bit of window dressing with elections. Part of the reason why we've seen such failure in Afghanistan is that the vast majority, something like 93% of the US budget was military. So if you look at the reforms that have been done, for instance, with the police, it's been about turning the Afghan police into a paramilitary force so that they're cannon fodder in the south and the east. And they die, the rates of attrition, they die far more than any other, than the army, than the international military, than civilians. It's the police that are dying, and that's because they're using as cheap cannon fodder. There hasn't been much resources put into building a justice system, into bringing rule of law. The emphasis has all been about security and justice later, justice later. So they haven't been given democracy. There hasn't been a nation-building effort. It's just all a showpiece. So I don't think democracy can be judged to have failed in Afghanistan or to be judged to be unpopular in Afghanistan because they haven't been given a chance yet. So that's the point about throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I mean, if you throw out the idea that democracy can work elsewhere, outside Western nations or in Islamic nations, then I think you make a mistake. What we've seen is that quick-fit elections don't work.
May I?
Yes.
Well, I'm just breathtaking generalization that our friend here has made about, the Muslim world. Anyone from Nigeria to Turkey to Indonesia.
I mean, the countries which are predominantly Muslim.
They
in terms of overwhelmingly Muslim numbers. I mean, just the point on that was that opinion survey after survey throughout, whether it's from Morocco through to Indonesia, all say that probably 2/3, 70% of people would like to see Sharia law as the basis of law in those lands. So that's surveys which have been done and repeatedly done in that world.
So in fact, then 200 years of history of secularism, secularized law, modern legal systems in Turkey, in Egypt, in the Arab Levant, in North Africa, all that is now subsumed and forgotten because of some opinion surveys, which we all know about. And what do people mean by Sharia anyway? And the fact of the matter is that these issues are contentious within these societies themselves and have been debated since the 19th century and have been highly sophisticated arguments and many debates and many conflicts, and that continues to the present day. And I think the example of Iran is very interesting. There you get a Islamic Republic which is ostensibly devoted to introducing the Sharia, but you look at the law in Iran now, the only elements of the Sharia are the ostensible elements in which they punish their political adversaries and also assert their authority by making women wear the hijab. And when you look at what Sharia means in Iran as against what it means in Saudi Arabia, it's an enormous difference, absolutely enormous. And to talk about the Islamic world as Obama himself also did, responding to the Islamic world, I think is absurd, utterly absurd. These are very different societies. Within each one of them, there are ideological and political contentions and conflicts, And you know, if you want to know what's happening, you have to look at them in a highly differentiated way.
Gentleman here. Was it? Did you wish to speak? Yes. Sorry, gentleman here. No? We'll get there.
As a visitor from California, I wonder if I can offer a couple of American perspectives on what's been going on. I first went to Afghanistan in 1957, working as a reporter for the Associated Press. I got caught in a firefight between two rival warlords. I went to the American embassy and I said, I went giving them some economic assistance, and he said, oh yes. I said, how much is it? $50 million a year. In 1957, there's a lot of money. I said, what's it for? He said, nation building. We never learned, you know, it just goes on and on. In El Salvador, the elections there in 1984, you had to go around the neighborhoods and find out why were there so many people standing in line to vote in an election. It was because they were denied milk, and firewood, and all the benefits of survival. And unless they got in line to vote, which of course they never got to the polling booths because the lines were so long, it was just incredible. In Taiwan, you talk about Taiwan. I remember Taiwan in 1959, 1960. Chiang Kai-shek wasn't about to have a free election. You know, it just was just absurd. But we went on and on and on and on. And I think one of the basic problems that comes across in all of this stories, all the things you've been talking about, I've experienced, many other people have, is the problem of the press. The problem of the press and how it covers an election, how it covers a political development and so forth. And in the United States, we have a problem, which I'm sure is not unique, but in our Congress and in Washington, the reporters there, most of them have never had foreign experience. They're there, and they're covering it. They're good reporters as far as their experience goes, but they don't know the right issues to which to really address it. So they listen, they go to the State Department, they go to government officials, they go to do-good NGOs, and they get that perspective. And it's all drummed around democracy, elections, free press, which of course none of this really ever happens, but we feel good by doing it. And so it's an inevitable problem which nobody really wants to deal with, unfortunately.
Thank you for your comments. I mean, your comments about the 1950s in Afghanistan remind me that it was the Helmand Valley project, financed by the Americans, that built all those hundreds of miles of irrigation ditches all over that area, which is now the main place that the Taliban are operating in. They use those ditches as cover, in fact. There's an extraordinary irony about that.
As a matter of fact, I just might add, we're talking about developing countries, but even in the developed countries, some of the problems are enormous. Look at it, we've had, from the time of the American occupation in Japan until last year, the Liberal Democratic Party was the one party that constantly got elected again and again. Someday, some scholars are going to write a book about the crooks in Japan, and you'll be shocked by what comes out about how these elections were fixed. And we went around, we covered these things, and we thought democracy was still in full flow, and of course it wasn't.
Gentleman there.
Yeah. It seems like there's a broad agreement on a couple of things. One is that functioning democracy is good, but that for democracy to function, you need certain conditions, and those conditions can take many years to build up. So hundreds of years in the case of Europe, maybe 20 years in the case of Southeast Asian countries. Humphrey, do you think that the conditions that existed in Southeast Asian countries can be easily replicated elsewhere? Because, I mean, I would say that possibly they couldn't, and if they can't, do you have a proposal for how they might be fostered in Afghanistan and Iraq?
Yes, I do. I mean, I do because of seeing what's happening in China now and seeing what's happening in Taiwan. And seeing how the Indonesia and the Philippines, the voting process there, the ballot box there has done a lot to nip Islamic extremism in the bud in both of those countries. So I think that there work's in progress, and that will all come together. I think Iraq, because its institutions were stronger, could, but you're talking about 100 years. I mean, one thing in one interview I did on this book that struck me is that America fought its civil war that ended, I think, in 1864. It wasn't until and they fought the war about civil rights and slavery and all that sort of stuff. It wasn't until 1964 that the federal government actually passed a law that gave rights for blacks to vote in the southern states. So that was 100 years for the cause of the war to come into law, and we still know that there's a lot of issues there for it to happen. So Afghanistan, I mean, you know, seems to be that much more back from where Iraq is as far as its institutions, civil society goes, or whatever. So whatever comes out of the end of the tube there is not probably going to be in any of our lifetimes. Having said that, in the 1970s, Vietnam and Cambodia were the starving, suffering scenes on our screens, and China and all that sort of thing, Cultural Revolution, and now these are the engines of growth for the developing world.
This gentleman here.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to agree with the fact that neither Sharia or democracy are static concepts. But I also think I want to hear your opinion on how accountable do you think we should hold like politicians for these projects, because we can certainly all agree, almost all agree, that nobody really knows how to build, I'm going to call it a Western-style democracy, or how to build, you know, a functioning society or a functioning nation. But we do know that the track record for trying to export Western-style democracies is pretty atrocious. I mean, we have 2 examples that are kind of viable. We have Western Germany and Japan, and these are very different from the other projects that have been done. And we know that in all these projects you have tons and tons and tons of civilian casualties. And where do you think those casualties, and like on whose responsibility are those in these democracy experiments?
I would question whether they actually were trying to, again, whether they actually were trying to build democracies. The gentleman in the front suggested maybe they didn't really want it, because maybe they don't really want the results of what a genuine democracy would be in a country like Afghanistan, where it's likely to be a deeply conservative, Salafi state. Those would be the parties that would probably win, and they probably didn't want to see that, which is why you got the Americans in the early years arguing for a very heavy presidential system, without the opportunity to build political parties, a parliament, platforms for other ideas, because a strong presidential system, well, it was like their own corrupt system and seemed to be much more controllable. So I think there's a real question about whether they wanted a genuine democracy in a country like Afghanistan. Far too unpredictable.
There's a lady at the back there on the right.
We've seen Afghanistan like as a crossroad for crusaders and invaders, right from Alexander to Britain to Soviet and now to the US. And it's more like a theater for predatory neighbors and international actors, and everyone's trying to weed out as much as they can out of Afghanistan. Now we know that Karzai has come into power and he's going to be the next president. And his legitimacy of his whole election is once again questioned. And that shows a smack, I feel, on the US, again, that they could not hold fair elections. It goes to the panel now. If any one of you were to advise the Obama administration or the president on the strategy on Afghanistan, what would your advice be? Like,
who would like to start with that?
Go on, Najib.
We should all have a go.
I think it would be difficult to give advice to Mr. Obama because he won't listen. But if he listens, I think he should start from scratch. Why the West has failed in Afghanistan, we have to go back to the Bonn Conference in December 2001. The foundation for building Afghanistan, bringing democracy and nation building, and the list, all the lists that they wanted to do in Afghanistan, the foundation was not right. It was built by one person, Zalmay Khalilzad, was the ambassador of United States to Afghanistan, Iraq, and then United Nations until end of President Bush administration. He sold a package to the United States, that this will work, which was based that we'll impose this, we'll get Karzai to Afghanistan, and will make deals with warlords. Afghans were denied justice. This is quite important. Afghans were denied justice in the name of democracy. You have to give justice first to work, and then after giving justice, then democracy will people embrace democracy. But Afghans were denied that in 2001. And what Obama is doing right now is actually building with on the mistakes of Bush's administration, by sending more troops, by trying to eat things that this war is winnable by force, by military means. I think the arrogance and the superiority of the West has made them blind. They're not seeing under their feet. They're just they think their superiority, their B-52s and high-tech weaponry, can are enabling them to get rid of at least 40% of the population who are supporting Taliban, or 50%, and they can their democracy, their vision of democracy will be accepted by the country. And I think Mr. Obama, what he does is he has to start from scratch. He has to see Afghanistan not in a view from American view. He has to wear different Afghan glasses, and talk to real Afghans who actually, are not happy with the current administration. What America is doing, they're bringing Western, wearing ties and suits. They're talking to those people. They're not talking to the people who are actually, on daily basis, joining Taliban forces. And I just want to say about the double standard. The West has spent millions of dollars. There was election for parliament, and Afghanistan had for the first time democratic elected parliament. This is how they call it, but it wasn't democratic because it's full of warlords. But anyway, this democratic parliament passed the law which allowed, as Free referred, allow men to have, the woman cannot refuse her husband to have sex. It was approved by the parliament, and then it rang all the bells, in the Western, countries. Oh, it's, it's, rape. Rape has been approved by, parliament. Well, it's tough. You spend millions of dollars, making this parliament, when this parliament is, making a law allowing husband to have forced sex with a wife, then it's oh, you don't want this, and this is, I think, double standards.
Lady here.
Thanks. A question to Humphrey. Do you think the nation state is here to stay over the longer term, because we're sort of premising democracy within the framework of a nation state, and we see so many supposedly failed and failing states? What comes? Is there something beyond the nation state?
I think the nation state's disappearing, because it's disappearing. If it's disappearing in Europe, almost completely. I mean, we've just had the Lisbon Treaty that's going to, and if we're a sort of modern, trading, whatever it is, free thinking, whatever Europe is, because it's had its tribal wars, it's had its all of this sort of stuff, the nation state is becoming irrelevant. I mean, am I a Catalan, or am I English? Am I British? Am I loyal to my Facebook account? I mean, where does my loyalty lie? And I think this is what's happening. So in, if you go back to the Taiwan example, hopefully the Afghan example, I mean, you talk to guys there that have been educated at the University of Hong Kong, the University of Columbia, or something like that, and they're, they're members of various associations and groups, and that's where people are. So I think the nation states will disappear, but this is the problem, because what's happening in a lot of the developing world, whether we're, wherever we are, is that when you are afraid, when you vote for these competing groups, in that thing, the group that wins takes all, including your head and your village and your house and your job. So you retreat back into your family or your tribe or your clan and fight for the life of that. And whether you talk to a Sinhalese in Sri Lanka or a Serb or whatever it is, this is the argument that's coming forward all the time. So you have to get rid of that, get rid of the nation state, and then just have this sort of global stuff where people, there are so many groups that you're part of that you're not part of one group that you're going to fight and die for.
I'm really interested in, here Humphrey is sitting in London at this time of the debates that are going on between the Conservative Party and within the Conservative Party and others about the Lisbon Treaty, and to be able to say within that the nation state is disappearing. I wouldn't have thought so at all. I mean, I think the whole thing about the European Union is that it is a union of nation states, and the nation states have got very strong identities and interests which they are all fighting within this common forum. And I think, of course, Afghanistan is very different. Afghanistan has never been a nation state. Whereas, most of the other countries, can you say that Egypt is going beyond the nation state? Never. Can you say the Islamists in Egypt are going beyond the nation state? Never. All their politics is concentrated within the nation state. Is Israel going below the nation state? I think the nation state, of course, depending which nation state, is mostly here to stay for a long, long time.
Gentleman there.
Thanks, Humphrey. I just looked at the latest Iraqi body count the other day, and I was just absolutely astounded by the enormously high figure of casualties just to bring about democracy in Iraq. I'm not quite sure it's really been worth that high figure. I probably would just contradict my friend here, but it just kind of brought back to mind a book that I read some time ago about the Spanish conquest of the Inca people, where they just massacred the Incas on the pretense of bringing Christianity on ungodly people. And just in 20th and 21st century, we're seeing exactly the same thing, except the word Christianity has just been replaced with democracy. And I'm not quite sure the high figure has just been worth it at all. And my question is, shouldn't democracy always be an evolutionary process that each country will have to undertake, rather than something that should be imposed from an outside? And the other one is, can you really have a democracy in a country where corruption is rife? And if weeding out corruption requires a cultural change, wouldn't democracy also require a cultural change? That's probably a question to Sami.
Sorry, it's a question to me, was it?
Can I take one or two more questions first, Sami, and then come back to you? Gentleman on the end of the queue, on the end of the line there.
Thank you. Can I play devil's advocate for a moment? We live in an age of sound bites and buzzwords. And the number one buzzword in the late 20th and early 21st century has been democracy. And we're indulging in it here tonight. It's taken for granted that democracy is great, but we don't actually go very deeply into what we actually mean by democracy. For example, there's been no discussion about economic democracy. We implied that simply putting a cross on a piece of paper every few years is in itself political democracy, and itself is enough. So we need to discuss much more deeply what exactly we mean by democracy. I would suggest that the key thing is that a true democratic system is one where people have some feel that they've got control over their own destiny, and I think that's regardless of how you actually implement that in various systems, that's the key to it. And if the people who talk about democracy, I would suggest, and I was for 14 years a local councillor, so I had a little bit of power there. I think the vast majority of us, in our heart of hearts, really believe that the best system would be a benevolent dictatorship, provided we were the benevolent dictator. So I put that to you. But in terms of what actually should be done, as far as Afghanistan and so many other places, the first priority is to stop the killing. However, whoever is doing it, it's difficult, I know, but One thing I would say would be an immediate ban on aerial bombardment in Afghanistan, which is inevitably indiscriminate and causes all sorts of further problems and reactions.
Thank you. Gentleman there, I'll take it away.
Yeah, should we achieve some sort of democracy in Afghanistan with institutions associated with it and an end to opium production, how would Afghanistan generate enough GDP and taxes to pay for all the institutions that go with the democracy, healthcare, education, etc., without foreign aid?
Well, you could ask the Chinese about that, because they've just bought up large chunks of Afghanistan because they realise there's a lot of money to be turned there in copper and other minerals. Person over here on the right, lady.
Following on from what you just said about China buying up large tracts of Afghanistan, I wish, as a Western voter, that our leaders would level with us and just explain their real motives in preaching democracy all over the world, because surely aren't those just strategic and to do with investment? And if they would be a little bit clearer with us about their reasons for promoting democracy, which really is a great way of imposing leaders that we can do business with, I think we'd feel a little bit more trust in them.
Thank you. Gentleman here. It's on its way.
It just occurred to me that one of the things that I think we're making a mistake here is assuming that our governments have a concerted policy. Obama's inherited Bush's war, Brown has inherited Blair's war. So to suggest that there is a kind of coherent story going on in these people's heads actually isn't true at all. What they're trying now to do is justify the position they find themselves in.
Yeah, because I think it's really, I mean, it gets to the nub of it, because everybody inherits, this is still on, is it? Everybody inherits something. I think it goes back to what I was saying before. In the Cold War, there was a cohesive policy called the policy of containment. Now, it did dreadful things, but we all knew what it was balanced up against. In the war on terror, which I guess this still is, there hasn't been this cohesive policy. And the policy is fundamentally to get, in order to stop the terrorism, is to get rid of the handful of people that want to do it, then raise living standards, give people dignity, and that freedom of economic stuff that we were talking about over there. How do you do that? You change the relationship that the government has with money. So at the moment, the governments of the failed states, the failing states, have a relationship with the multinational and the donor. It has to have a relationship with its own citizens who are paying tax, and then that gives the citizens the right to demand things, whether that is through elections or whether it's through any other means. It's because the citizen will be the stakeholder in it. Now, that's not happening, I get, in Afghanistan at all, is it? I mean, you know, it's not happening there at all, but it is happening in Cuba and China and places like that, these communist states. So you've got to find a way to change that economic relationship. So what hasn't happened is, you're right, something's going on in Miliband's mind one day and Gordon Brown's mind the other, and the other. And they have these huge conferences like the Bonn Conference of what we envisage on this place. But there isn't a cohesive policy to deal with the failed state. And that's what needs to be bought out and sold to us as citizens, and to see whether it's going to work somewhere.
And in Afghanistan, there have been several competing agendas. So you've had a counter-terror war, you've had a counter-insurgency campaign, you've had a counter-narcotics war, and you've had the counter-terror, crudely speaking, you've had the counter-terror war primarily led by special forces who've done a lot of the airstrikes, which has undermined the counter-insurgency campaign, which is meant to be about winning support from the people. And then you've got the counter-narcotics campaign, which is partly about British interests here, and it's partly because they see it as feeding into the Taliban's strength. But then you've got, you know, Ahmed Wali Karzai, the brother of President Karzai, one of the biggest drug lords in the country, who we learn now is a CIA asset. So there's total chaos in all these policies. So we've got Obama now with his, you know, epic pause as he tries to work out what to do with Afghanistan. And it's not surprising, really, because he's doing about 3 different things at once. And actually, we see that now as well. Post-election, we've got everyone obsessing about how governance and corruption is what it's all about now and what has to change. And at the same time, you've also got a slide, an inexorable slide towards deals with the Taliban being the solution, the exit strategy in Afghanistan. And you've got the generals just being given $1.2 billion to play with in 2010 to buy Talibs, whilst at the same time saying it's all about cleaning it up and corruption and, you know, cleaning our relationship up with what we do with spending there. So, I mean, there's always about 5 different things happening all at once and you know, undermining the other strategies.
Gentleman here.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick comment, and that is just regard to what I think all the panelists and also people on the floor also have talked about, and that is how democracy literally is failing a lot of other states. Now, my question is, we are being told the world is globalizing, being interdependent, and then we're trying to export this democracy that seems to be failing those kind of states. Yeah, I'll give you a good example. Congo, DRC Congo, I think in the early 90s, yeah, Congo, Mobutu was asked to open up the political space there. And I think what happened there, we saw the country literally totally collapse. Up to today, it cannot get back on its feet. And, you know, 7 million lives. You're talking about killing in the process of democracy. That was a classical failure of democratic kind of project failing. Now, my question really, since the system is failing, is there any, can we see what can be replaced by a tool, if any?
A very good question. I think that is getting to the nub of things here, because I'm slightly surprised, in a sense, listening to this conversation here, that we have, with almost no disagreement, accepted the idea that democracy is failing to develop the world. Is that really the case here in this room? Does everybody think that that's the case? Perhaps so we could hear some more arguments that challenge that idea. Not that you have to, but I can't see where that arm is attached. It's you. Yes, sorry.
Well, I'm not sure I'm going to quite do that, but I did want to make a point about the upcoming elections in Iraq, like the gentleman did in the back. While I'm not, I probably sort of agree with Churchill and our rather eminent writer, whose name I can't remember, who says that democracy admits of difference and allows for criticism. And these are quite difficult concepts to sell, I think, countries that have experienced nothing but conflict. You're trying to offer a democracy as an alternative to armed struggle and say to them, this is the legitimate way that you can resolve your differences. Now, that isn't going to work in every country, in every place, because in each case, you know, they're dealing with quite different situations to start with, I think, which is what the gentleman was trying to point out in the first place. I mean, Afghanistan and Iraq are completely different countries. Iraq has something of an infrastructure to start with. It has some of those organizations in place, and it may just be that the upcoming elections in January may offer, for the first time, some kind of significance in terms of the outcome of it. However, I'm not either a person who espouses the idea that it's just results and being seen to have elections and putting papers in ballot boxes that really count. But I think it's amazing that Iraq hasn't come up quite so often in this particular discussion as it might have done in the past, and that might just signify that people are coming to terms with the fact that there is some kind of stability arriving there, even if it's been punctuated by horrible, spectacular explosions recently. But it may also be that the people of Iraq think that there may be a future beyond the next set of elections, and they do seem to be talking about what they want from their politicians, as opposed to just seeing the elections as a great, celebration. It's like, okay, what does that mean after that? How do we understand ideas around accountability, things which don't necessarily come naturally, let's say, to countries that have experienced nothing but dictatorships for previous 25 years. Okay.
Thank you. Anybody hasn't spoken yet? There's a number of people who want to speak again, but I'd like to take other speakers. No? In which case, gentleman here.
I'd just like to point out, we're talking about the internal problems of most of these countries. The problem, frankly, is really in the United States, where U.S. policy drives so much of what's going on. And you have to understand what's happened to Obama. Obama's the most refreshing development in American politics in 40 years. I mean, and what the plate that he's been handed has been so terrible. For us domestically, you have to understand what's going on. He really, his limitations, his expectations, his limitations are different. And he's got a Republican Party that refuses to admit that it lost the last election. So they obstruct everything that goes on that he's trying to do. And he's faced with domestic problems like health care, like the energy, like getting the country green, all these kinds of things. He looks at Afghanistan, and the problem is handed to him. Well, not really handed to him. He was trying to get out and make sure he could get out of Iraq. So Afghanistan became the focal point of his foreign policy pronunciations to say, let's deal with Afghanistan. Who does he turn to? He turns to 4 generals, none of whom got out of West Point until after the Vietnam War was over. And when the Vietnam War was over, the generals at that point said, never again should we get involved in another war without the complete support of the American people. Well, now what you've got all of these guys who graduated West Point in 1978, something like that, onward, giving him advice. And the think tanks are giving him advice. The same old people we used to see who gave advice on Vietnam. So it's the internal frustrations that drive American policy really have an effect on what's going on with the unhappiness that we've all heard here tonight about the internal contradictions in these countries that have no real experience with democracy or so forth. But I think it's a real problem. Give Obama a little break. He's a really extremely intelligent guy. He's intellectual, he's thoughtful, but he doesn't have any foreign experience. Yes, he went to born in the Philippines or went to the Philippines when he was a young boy, but he's got a big problem ahead of him.
Thank you. Gentleman here.
It strikes me that there's one word that we've always been using with democracy, and that's Western democracy. So is there a different kind? Is there a different model of democracy that might be more useful? And maybe our professor of political science.
I think the big social experiment that's going on is China. Okay, it's still a dreadful repressive regime if you get on the wrong side of it. But if you want to get a mortgage for a house or start a business or buy a car or travel the world or go to be a tourist in Disneyland, you can do that. And then, and this is the big social, it's not democracy, it's something like that, but that is the model that everybody's looking at, because it's lifting people out of poverty, it's slowly bringing in freedoms, then it goes and clamps down over the Olympics and the 60th anniversary, and everybody says, what the hell's going on there? So it's going on its bumpy road. But I mean, the point here interests me, again, with the China thing, is that so many people in writing this book that I came to said it's not what we do or what we think, it's how America's going to react to it that causes the actual ructions, and whether it's a vote in Latin America, or whether it's something that happens in Africa, or whether it's a Hamas vote in Gaza or something, it's the American reaction to it that creates the tension, and that's what people said time and time again to me.
I think we are drawing towards an end. There's a few more questions. Quite happy to take those, but we're probably going in that direction. Lady at the back there.
I was working in Africa when the election between when Kerry lost, thanks to the Florida Supreme Court. It just reminds me of a good joke on democracy. I thought we were a bit light on jokes tonight. Al Gore was lecturing in Eastern Europe, and he was asked by some journalism students what he thought the best form of democracy was, after Florida, obviously. And he said, I kind of like the one where the guy who gets the most votes wins.
Thank you for that. There's a lady just in front of that lady, I think, who wants to speak again.
It's just a comment. Obama is trying to fight a war, and then there's a full stop after that. It's because wars come to an end only if one side is defeated, or if both the parties get tired of fighting and conflict, or if there is a political reconciliation. But Karzai is not ready to politically reconcile with his opponents, which is kind of evident that democracy is kind of impossible to work in this case. And second thing what I wanted to say is that even if more troops are added into Afghanistan, there is no way US can fight Al-Qaeda or Taliban, which I personally feel they should, but they won't be able to because it's growing as an international network. So they need to change their mechanism towards fighting Al-Qaeda and Taliban because they are just not in Afghanistan.
I think I'm going to ask the panel here to make some concluding remarks. We've had a lot of comments, and most people have had a chance to speak now, so I think I'm going to have to draw it towards an end. One point I would make, just in relation to what you just said, is that there's an extraordinary difference on either side of the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. On the Pakistan side, we have seen the army in recent months completely destroy the Taliban in Swat, and they appear, from everything I can see, to be well on their way to doing the same in South Waziristan. It's a rather extraordinary fact that just a few miles on the other side of the border, there's a completely different situation. And I think that begs an awful lot of questions, which maybe not for tonight, but I think they are very significant questions. But can we start maybe with you, Rachel, and just ask you to give some concluding remarks about this evening's discussion, which I think has been great. Thank you very much.
You probably know where I'm coming from, really. I mean, I think one of the things that would be helpful if there is much more honesty from the West, and they stop talking about democracy so much, and start being a bit more honest about, as has been said, what their actual strategic ambitions are, and actually what they are capable of achieving. Because actually what they're doing in the meantime is devaluing the word of democracy. As Najib says, it now has a really bad name in Afghanistan, because Afghans don't have democracy, clearly. So they associate it with all sorts of other things. I've got a diary teacher who was having to choose between several wives recently, several potential wives, and he was very mournful because his favourite, who had a 99% perfect body, he wasn't going to be able to choose because she wore too many democracy clothes. So unless we stop, so we need to be. So this is the image Afghans have of democracy for now. So we should keep quiet about it until they actually have it.
Najibullah.
I think what Afghanistan needs is basic living standards. Drinking water, electricity, and more importantly, security. And then, democracy, election, they can come afterward. Karzai, before election, everybody knew Karzai is going to win because he's West darling, he's a puppet, he's not elected by a majority of Afghans.
And he'd done a deal with every warlord worth his salt.
Exactly, and he made a deal with every single warlord from north to east to west, you can imagine. And actually, Afghans doesn't know what a vote is. General Dostum was actually brought from Turkey to encourage. General Dostum is a powerful, I'm not going to say warlord.
War criminal.
No, he's a nice man. It was brought specially to guarantee Karzai Uzbek votes because he's the head of Uzbeks. Uzbeks don't like him, but because he's so, feared that there was a report on Al Jazeera that the people said, we don't care, we don't care about democracy, we don't care about the voting. We're going to vote to that person whichever Dostum tell us. If Dostum tell us to vote for a tree, we're going to vote for a tree. If he tell us to vote for a donkey, we vote for a donkey. And if he asks us to jump from a mountain, we're going to jump. So they actually, they don't know the meaning of democracy. In this election in Afghanistan, I think it was waste of money, and I'm so sorry about the life that was lost on, on the military side, on the civilians, and also lots of people who lost their ears or fingers because they voted, and everybody knew it's going to be Karzai, and Abdullah is the other contenders in this election. It wasn't after winning. It was just wanted a share of the power. I mean, today there was a report that he approached. There was meeting between him and Karzai. Karzai wanted to give him position in government, but he said, I don't want position in government. I want power in government. So I don't know if you know the meaning. He wants like half of the government to himself. His supporters are saying, we don't want half the government. We just want positions like ministries. So I think Afghan needs is basic standards first, and then instead of sending more troops and to achieve security and long-term peace in Afghanistan, a meaningful negotiation with all sides that's fighting NATO and Karzai government, and also draw a line, a border, what we can impose in Afghanistan. You cannot have an Afghanistan similar to Western countries, and because the fact people are more religious, and as a gentleman over there said, the majority of those countries in favor of Sharia law, because democracy failed them. They didn't provide justice, but Sharia gave them justice. I just I spent some time in Wardak in end of 2006, 7, talking to people, and they were all, that was, Karzai has lost control, Karzai government lost control from that place, and all these people are saying, we are so glad the Taliban are back. Why? Because they guarantee that they're going to return our land back to us. They're going to execute the person who killed my brother. They're not going to just put him in prison and then he's going to bribe and he's going to be released. So the justice, the swift justice that Taliban or the Sharia is delivering to the population, it make them more popular than the democracy the West as imposing on Afghanistan, which meaning which has the wrong kind of image to the Afghans as corruption, drink and pub in nightclubs, and naked, half-naked women. Sorry.
Yes, well, I mean, I don't know how to conclude after this very wide-ranging discussion. Except to say, well, I think it's quite clear, first of all, that democracy is not the default mode of human society. That, in fact, democracy is really developed in highly specific circumstances in highly specific places, and now it has become a kind of an ideological symbol rather than a reality, as has been said by all around. This is not to say, however, that the kind of components of what is known as democracy, and in particular, it's not so much the elections, not so much representation, but the rule of law. The Taliban justice may be popular with some, but I would hate to think that a society is ruled by Taliban justice would be a just society. But then the rule of law, the legal institutions, respect for human rights, all these things are components of what we call democracy. And I think this is something that people with liberal humanitarian views must strive for. And the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International are laudable organizations for pursuing these things. Now, obviously, you can have reasonably decent societies without elections or regular elections or limited elections. How you can achieve those, I really don't know. But what is quite clear is that this democracy is a slogan, and it isn't so much that the sort of Western arrogance, because the actual Western politicians, while they were shouting democracy, were at the same time making deals with the warlords. So in this respect, it becomes a kind of ideological symbol rather than a program or a reality. But I do hope that by renouncing the idea of this democracy, the default for human societies, we don't at the same time renounce the kind of objectives and ideals which go with the advocacy of democracy, which is decent societies, human rights, rule of law, which I think is the most important.
Thank you, Sami. And finally, can I ask you to sum up, please?
I like the democracy clothes thing, because in Iraq they have this thing that they say, be nice to the Americans or they'll punish you with democracy. And I think there's a question over here that I didn't answer. I'll try to answer now what Obama should do. Well, Afghanistan seems to be a badge for superpowers. So the British, as my colleague David Loyne wrote, butcher and bolt. Then the Soviets went in, and now the Americans are in. So I suspect that the next people that should be invited in, possibly before the next election under a UN peacekeeping mandate, would be the Chinese. And then perhaps it's be nice to the Chinese or what? So that could be the option they've got, either a Chinese army or an American army in there. I don't know, up for grabs.
At least China has a border.
At least China has a border.
With Afghanistan.
Yes, that's true, yes.
It only remains really to say thank you very much for your participation this evening. It's been a great discussion, and please do come again. Thank you very much indeed.